Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is your program that brings you news updates, analysis, and discussion on religious liberty events in the US and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty Magazine, and my guest on this program is my good friend, attorney Alan Reinach. And you have many titles, but you're the executive director of the California-based Church-State Council. We'll go with that one.
Fair enough. Glad to be with you, Lincoln.
And as a lawyer particularly, let's talk a little bit about one of the recent decisions of the Supreme Court. They dealt with what lay people, and I'm one of them, would say the cake case, right?
Masterpiece Cake Shop. So Jack Phillips is a baker in Colorado. He's a Christian. He was asked to bake a cake for a same-sex couple, and he refused. And so he was brought up on charges with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission and found to have discriminated against them on the basis of sexual orientation. And of course, I think
went on appeal up to the Supreme Court.
All the way to the Supreme Court. Now, both sides are claiming victory in this case. And in fact,
now who are the sides?
Well, all right. So
maybe there's more than two.
This is a very interesting look. The number one conflict in America, in terms of religious freedom, is this conflict between LGBT rights and religious freedom, especially for Christians and especially for Christian institutions that uphold what I like to call the biblical view of human sexuality. Because properly understood, it's not discriminatory against people with a same-sex orientation. You know, it's a view of human sexuality that consistently discourages sex outside of heterosexual marriage for anyone, whether you're heterosexual or otherwise.
Yeah, don't you think it's unduly polarized? Because any biblically based Christian or reads their Bible and stands by it would think that to steal, you know, whether it's at gunpoint on the street corner or from a company, embezzling from the company, that this is a crime, this is immoral. But I don't know of any history of Christians, you know, with posters out front of a prison or mistreating ex-prisoners because of a crime. Well, we see this as the foible of fallen human beings, and we try to witness to them and have them mend their ways and join the Christian community. It's not a holier than thou, you know, go to hell and stay there type approach.
Look, religious freedom is suffering, as is the gospel itself, by the very harsh culture war hostility that, you know, some Christians are nurturing. Now, part of that, honestly, I have to lay the blame at the feet of both preachers and unaffiliated Christian organizations that need conflict to raise money.
Yeah, I think you're right.
This is part of the whole equation. I've seen this for decades, and I've been so thankful to be part of a denominationally based organization. We're affiliated with the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We're not independently raising money. I don't have to express, you know, a hysterical opinion to get people scared enough to give me money. You know, and that's what I see happening both from the liberals and the conservatives. I used to say that the likes of, you know, the culture warriors in the Christian community like Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell, they were in a sick symbiotic relationship with the culture warriors on the left like Barry Lynn of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. You know, they needed each other to raise money and to build up their own power base. Well, let's get back to Jack Phillips, though. So Phillips has
I'm trying to give a cultural backdrop to it, because it doesn't make sense to some people.
Well, so he has an objection. He feels, according to the records in the case, it's his belief that baking the special cake to honor a same-sex
and probably it's not the
wedding,
baking, it's the decorating that got to him mostly, right?
Well,
putting an artistic input into it where he would have to invest his feelings and creativity and so on, right?
Bottom line, he felt that would be an expression of speech, an endorsement, and a violation of his conscience. So you have two sets of rights here. Colorado has broad anti-discrimination laws that apply to businesses, public accommodations laws. Now, these laws predate the American Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Colorado's laws go back to statehood. Shortly after statehood in the 19th century, they began to prohibit discrimination in public accommodation. So these laws are very ancient. They were amended more recently to include sexual orientation, and businesses generally can't discriminate. You have to serve people regardless of their age or sex or, disability or religion, et cetera. So you have these two sets of rights: rights of conscience, right not to be discriminated against. They go all the way to the Supreme Court, and what does the Supreme Court do? It punts, and it gives a victory to nobody.
Yeah, I thought you were going to explain how.
Well, yeah, no, I will.
They felt there was prejudice on the part of those representing the gay lobby. The way they'd expressed themselves ahead of time showed that they really had the animus, even though they brought it out of him.
So you have an administrative judge that issues a decision, and then it's reviewed by the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. There were 2 hearings at the commission, and 2 of the 4 commissioners expressed significant hostility to the notion of religious discrimination. So they viewed Phillips as being discriminatory, and they lumped it with the Nazi Holocaust, they lumped it with the history of slavery and Jim Crow laws, etc. And the Supreme Court said, when you adjudicate these conflicts of rights, religion has a right to be treated fairly. The government can't be hostile to religious claims. Now, there's a backstory here. The backstory is that the Supreme Court 30 years ago destroyed the constitutional value of religious freedom. And this is something that
Smith case.
The Peyote case, Employment Division against Smith, because religious free exercise, religious conscience has now been relegated to, I say the back of the civil rights bus, or even being dragged behind the civil rights bus, like a lynching practically. Because of that, the Supreme Court was not able to engage in the traditional weighing of rights. And let me explain what that would look like. So you have a neutral law. When I say neutral, the civil rights law in Colorado, it doesn't target people of faith, especially. It applies to everybody. So it's not discriminatory in its language, but in its application to Mr. Phillips, arguably, it's restricting his religious freedom, okay? So the question is, how do you resolve these conflicts? Well, under the traditional view, you would say, does the state have a compelling interest in eradicating discrimination? That's a pretty easy question to answer. Yes. State's interest in prohibiting discrimination broadly, that's a compelling interest. It may have other
compelling interests. I always object to that statement added to the
I know you do. But let's, but then the next question is it necessary in order to achieve that interest to restrict the religious conscience of Jack Phillips? You have to have, it's called a least restrictive means analysis. Yeah. So his rights get considered. That kind of analysis the court no longer engages in. They only ask, is the law itself discriminatory? Is it neutral in its language? And the answer clearly is yes. So free exercise doesn't even get to first base. You don't have a claim, which is why the lawyers for Jack Phillips litigated this as a free speech case. Now, we don't traditionally think of baking a cake as expression. There's another case involving Elaine photography. Wedding photography, we can relate to a little bit more as an art form, as, expression. But baking a cake, well, Jack is the unusual baker. I mean, he calls it Masterpiece Cake Shop because, you know, he fancies himself a bit of an artist, and he engages with the couple to understand where they're coming from and to craft.
I don't have any problems saying these are both creative endeavors.
You don't, but, you know, reasonable people differ on whether, you know, this is free speech. I'll give you an example. One of the champions of free speech in the legal academy is a law professor out of UCLA by the name of Eugene Volokh. And he runs a religion law listserv. So Eugene Volokh would side with the baker in the Baker case. I'm sorry, would side with the photographer, but as free speech, but would not agree that the cake is free speech. You know, now that's not to say he's right, but just that, you know, a thoughtful academic. Because
they've started with a premise that we would say is wrong, and then come to conclusions that are troubling.
So the problem in this case starts with we have a faulty legal landscape that does not properly value religious conscience claims.
And what I don't think helps things much, that this is clearly a provocation. I've said it on this program before. Things like wedding photography and making a wedding cake, or it's not up for legal challenge, but where you're going to have your wedding dress made. You go where someone's simpatico, right? It's somewhat self-regulating. And if gays knew that this was a Christian cake maker or whatever, they probably wouldn't knock on the door to start with. They would go where they feel they're among fellow travelers. So I think it's a setup from the get-go.
Well, there's no question. And the upshot of it is after 2 weeks after he wins, or, you know, he wins in the sense that the court reverses the decision against him. So in that sense, it is a win for him. Yeah. But then a transgender person had ordered a cake, and the Colorado Commission rules against Jack Phillips, saying that he discriminated against this transgender person because he wouldn't bake a blue and pink cake to celebrate their transition.
Well, let me throw something in, and we need to take a break shortly. But, you know, I've heard over and over again, and I know that generally this is true, that it doesn't matter what your position is, per se, if you hold something as a point of conscience that's a deeply held conviction, that needs to be honored. So it does, on one level, it seems to me it doesn't have to be proven that he has a biblical position or that it's consistent with what other churches hold. He's troubled by this, and his feelings on one level should be respected, right?
Well, but here's the rub, Lincoln. Historically, the Southern white Christian church held either slavery or segregation as religious dogma.
Right. You brought it up, and I brought it before. Because I remember when I first came to the U.S., people were being turned away from stores on a biblical basis, but underneath it was racism.
I will tell you that my kids' generation, they see Christian attitudes towards gays of a same piece with Christian attitudes towards blacks. And that's the problem. We can talk about liberty of conscience in the abstract, but when you're talking about the right to discriminate, it's a tough sell.
Yeah. And before the program, we were talking about some of the dynamic that preceded this, and I've always objected to gay and transgender and lesbian and so on rights being equated with the civil rights movement. I don't think it's a direct comparison. We'll take a short break, and we'll come back to this very loaded discussion that derives from a recent Supreme Court action. Stay with us. Welcome back to Liberty Insider. We were so eager to get going that we were almost jumping the gun, because this is a hot topic. And with my guest, Alan Reinach, we started by just legalese, talking about a Supreme Court action which most people probably didn't hear about, or if they did, it didn't mean much. But there's a lot riding on how the courts and our legal system adjudicates between what has become the competing rights, religious rights and gay rights.
And it bears saying, Lincoln, that the court did not reach the core issue in the case. the court paid lip service both to, gay rights and their rights to be served and not discriminated against when they go to restaurants and go to businesses, as they should. They also paid lip service to the rights of religious conscience, but they never resolved the conflict between them. And, it remains for future cases to figure out.
And there will be future cases, because
of course there will.
I think both parties are pushing stuff up through creating cases designed to be sent to the Supreme Court.
The culture war has become a bit of a zero-sum game. A zero-sum game means, both sides are playing for keeps. No, only, there's winners,
prisoners.
take no prisoners, winners and losers. But you know who the real loser in the culture war, in my perception, the real loser is the gospel itself. Because when Christians fight so hard against gay rights, what happens? Secular people, well-meaning people, not just activists, but they think badly. They see the church and the Jesus of the church as bigoted, as racist, as homophobic, as anti-gay, as full of hate. Now, the Jesus that you and I know and love is not a Jesus of hate. He said, he died to save the entire world, not just a few. He didn't just die for the straight people, he died for everybody.
Now, we've, on this program, spoken about this issue, not this decision per se that I can remember, a lot. And that's been my view. I think Christians are at great risk of being portrayed as hard-edged bigots who don't want to even deal with such people, unclean, It seems to me, from what I know, and of course everyone has to act according to their conscience. I can't tell anyone, least of all another Christian, how they should react in this situation. But what if they'd come into this guy's cake shop, and as he came in, he welcomed, glad you chose my business, and then they ask him to do it, and he says, well, thank you for choosing my store, but I have to tell you, I'm a Bible-believing Christian, and my book warns against you or says something against your lifestyle, and I certainly can't endorse that lifestyle. But I want to tell you, if you still want to go with me, great. But I may not be the best person to do this for you.
I don't know if you're going to see this as a sufficient
How
parallel.
is that denying his faith or refusing service?
So, but let me tell you about an experience I had years ago when I was first practicing law in New York. And I went to a Education Day event at one of the churches there in the Bronx. And these folks were, so on Education Day, you're telling the high school kids and the younger kids about, what it means to be a lawyer and what you do as a lawyer, that sort of thing. And there was a doctor and a dentist and, a teacher, some other people there. The grown-ups were giving me such a hard time. How can you be a lawyer and a Christian? How can you represent the guilty? And I'm like, well, people who have gone wrong, they need some grace. They need to have a Christian witness. If there's no Christians in the system anywhere, how are they ever going to find Jesus? Yeah. And, it strikes me if Christians now maybe, should I, if I'm not a criminal defense attorney, but should Christians say, well, we're not going to do criminal defense because these are sinners, so we're not going to help these sinners who have committed these crimes? Well, to me, that's a little bit like saying, well, I'm a baker, but I'm not going to bake for.
But you don't necessarily, when you get a client, you don't claim to know more than the judge will know after a whole trial and all the evidence that he's guilty. Well, you might have a personal inference.
We've had to struggle with this, Lincoln, because it turns out that, not all the cases we take and the clients we take are as upstanding as we thought to begin with, and sometimes we come away thinking that the employer was right to fire them.
But I remember Antonin Scalia telling a story about the horse thief that was brought to trial before a friendly court. And they said he's not guilty, but he doesn't have to give back the horses. So I guess it's possible to be complicit, but I don't think lawyers as a philosophical matter, buy into the guilt of someone that's accused of a crime. You're wanting them to get a fair hearing.
Right.
And it may turn out that you help someone that's guilty, but that's not really your job. You're to be an advocate. And Christ is our advocate.
Exactly.
We're guilty to start with.
So,
and he's redeeming us.
But coming back to Jack Phillips, I mean, you raise a good question as a theological matter. Is that the best or the only position for Christians to take, to refuse to serve the gay couple? And that's a valid discussion to have, and I have my questions as well. I mean, I'm not a theologian, I'm a lawyer, but from a legal standpoint, of course, he has every legal right to have his religious convictions and to have them respected. And I do think that the Supreme Court's decision showed respect for his beliefs. It remains to be seen. Going back to the decision in Obergefell, where Kennedy wrote the majority opinion approving of same-sex marriage. Of course,
Kennedy's gone now too,
but
so the dynamic will change.
The decision paid lip service to the right to believe what you want about human sexuality, but it did nothing to express support for the right to act according to your beliefs.
So do you think that this is a continuation of what, under the Obama administration, we took them to task a bit? And the president himself, he early on was inclined to talk about freedom of worship, not freedom of religion. And even the communist system allowed freedom of worship to hold a view and within narrow confines to sing hymns and so on, but not to go out and put it into action. That's really what's at stake, isn't it?
Well,
or free exercise,
as
the Constitution says.
I think the culture warriors are misreading the trend of history, frankly, because I think the trend of history is to secularize, and instead of being so combative, we need to be more gospel-focused. And ultimately, that's going to be where the power is. Christ says, if I be lifted up from the world, from the earth, I will draw all men. And if the church is failing, it's because we're not lifting up Christ and showing Jesus properly. And when we're fighting these culture war battles, we're alienating people rather than drawing them to Christ.
Right. And you're right. And so the thing is to represent Christ, not protect ourselves. And the story that even as you're talking comes to mind, people wouldn't normally use it this way, but the man on the Jericho Road, lying there in his blood and his gore, and the priest pulls his skirts up, walks by. I think there's a certain charity involved here, not endorsing someone else's lifestyle, but a Christian needs to reach out and help in whatever way they can. I don't think that means that you put all the flourishes on the cake, because you can't be enthusiastic about it. But you definitely will help them in their lost condition, and by charity and then a word spoken in season. People think witnessing is, push it down their throat. But when you're on side with someone and you're helping them in this wedding, they can call it what they want. Not a biblical wedding, but you're helping them in this. Maybe then you could insert a biblical view of why you had this reticence to start with that you spoke about.
Well, the real question to me is, Jack Phillips missed an opportunity to show the grace of Christ to this couple, that somehow in showing them a Christian witness, a lot of secular people, a lot of gay people expect hostility from Christians. And so they're reinforced in their opposition to Christianity when they get rejection.
And like it or not, just from the material in their own community, there's a lot of self-hatred. They're not as self-confident as they make out. They don't need further condemnation. If anything, that will give them a false sense that they're justified in opposing you. But to be charitable and human towards someone and then maybe drop the word that this is out of harmony with God's word, who knows?
Well, look,
that might gain their conscience.
On a basic gospel orientation, I think the mistake that the church has made is that we make people's sexuality a barrier between themselves and Christ. And that's not the way it should be. We really should send the message that There is no barrier. Jesus died for you. You can encounter Christ. You can have a relationship with Christ. And Christ alone is the one who's going to deal with sinners and clean us up, reform us, change us. We worship Christ.
King Solomon was asked once to adjudicate between two women claiming the same child. And one never knows how he was going to execute it, but his proposal was slice the child in two, give half each. Obviously, they'd each have half a dead child. I pity the Supreme Court of late because in a recent case, the cake maker case, for want of a formal title, in essence, they were asked to divide liberties, rights, in half between the rights of Christians to witness and to stand on their faith and the newfound civil right of gays and transgenders and their pressure group. I'm not sure that this right can be equally divided, and it's unfortunate that it becomes a conflict between rights. But what is certain is that Christians in their witness cannot afford to offend people. We need to be as inclusive in the right way as Christ was, condemning the sin, but even partying with the publicans, if you like. We need to avoid crying leper and see, as Christ did, a soul to be saved in every situation. The legal battle will continue, but more important is the moral one in the witness of Christians. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.